Hey guys, so I haven't done rulings or tip videos for Cyber Dragons in a while, so today I'll be bringing part 2 of the Cyber Dragon tips. If you haven't checked out my first tip video from about 8 months ago, I'll link that in my ruling videos below for you to watch. As a disclaimer though, those videos were done in the very early days of the channel, so you'll notice a difference in quality. Now keep in mind that perhaps in the future when you're watching this, some of the tips may not apply, depending on new cards that are released over time or the ban list. Anyways, let's just get started. Okay, so for some of the newer Cyber Dragon players, you may be seeing Link Spider in the extra deck and you may be wondering why that's in there. So let's just kind of get to that point. So let's say you have the core in her, so you use core to use its effect and search that repair plant to get the access to the Galaxy Soldier, because we have the hers in hand this time. So you would link off into Mirage, you have a Cyber Dragon engrave, you can use the repair plant and add that Galaxy Soldier. And then of course from here, you would pitch to hers, summon the soldier, chainlink one soldier, chainlink to hers, and you would add the Cyber Dragon and the second soldier and just do the same. So that's 4 summons. And then you go into Nova, and that is your 5th summon. And at this point, your opponent will probably feel pressure to drop the Nibiru because you could go into Infinity. And so usually this is where you get Nibiru. And so for example, you get the Nibiru token, and then you can trigger Nova's effect because it was sent to the graveyard by opponent's card effect while it was in your possession. And at this point, then you also see something like Mechaba in here, but in this instance, we're just gonna get rid of it right away. So you would link that token for that Link Spider. So that's where it comes up, so you can get an effect monster, so that you can get into Anaconda, and then you can use Anaconda's effect essentially to bring out Dragoon. So that's where that Nibiru or rather the Link Spider can come up the most instance, but there are other situations. So for example, if your opponent plays Dinos, the Lost World token is quite problematic for us, and I'll go over that in another scenario later in this video. But because you can only target the token if you control a token and they have Lost World, you can't use Machine Dupe, right? So that's why being able to get rid of that into a Link Spider so that you're free from that restriction is also very helpful with a Link Spider. So next, if you actually hard drew like this sort of hand, which is great, as long as you have some other going second cards too. So usually people, I find, will start off with the hers and soldier play first instead of using the core, just to see if this gets hand trapped, for example. And by doing the soldier and hers play first, you can basically get to Infinity first before the Nibiru can drop, and then you can use the core and search whatever, and you have that Infinity negate. The exception, for example, one exception at least, would be in instances when you're going against a deck where you know is playing there can be only one. In that instance, I would start off with the core, and for example, you could search something like Cybernetic Overflow just in case with their back row. But the reason for this is because if they flip there can be only one, and you started with the core or like a baby Cyber Dragon, realistically enough, you could at least link it off into Mirage, which is a Cybers. And then for example, if you were to use Soldier, and then you just use its effect and you get the 2 cards, so at least now you have 2 monsters, and then you can again link it off, still under there can be only one, into Predaplant Verde Anaconda, which is a plant. And at this instance, you can either, for example, you could bring out Rampage with the Overload Fusion, and then this can pop the back row, including there can be only one. Or let's say you just want to bring out Dragoon and just kind of grind from there, then you can do that as well. So that's a way of playing through there can be around there can be only one. It also doesn't have to be soldier. If it's something like Nax, for example, just anything where you can special another body out with different typing so you can play around there can be only one. That's one example there. Now another type of hand is if you had something like this, again, pretty good and all, best you could ask for really. Sometimes I do find players, even with this hand, they would start off with the soldier and hers play. So I'll just do this play quickly first and add the soldier and Cyber Dragon and sort of do this again. And what they're trying to do basically is they want to go into Nova here, use Nova's effect to detach, bring that Cyber Dragon hers, go into Infinity, and then they want to use the Machine Dupe to bring out the 2 Cyber Dragons. Now the reason I personally don't do this route is A, it's a little greedy. So for example, you realistically always only just need the Infinity and just 2 bodies to make the Anaconda, and then bring out either Dragoon or Rampage, and that's probably OTK, because if your opponent has monsters, then bringing out Dragoon makes more sense because you could pop and burn and then attack for game. Or if your opponent has nothing on the field, then you would bring out Rampage because that's the way to enable the OTK. So you never really need this extra body unless you would do this route if that one extra Cyber Dragon, for example, is really the difference maker, which probably doesn't happen too often. And so the reason why I don't do this play is that A, it's not usually necessary, but B, it can be more hand trap prone. So for example, let's kind of go back and pretend we got hand trapped. So for example, if in this instance, let's say just pretend these were the only extenders that you had and the rest were like going second cards, right? So if you started off with this play first, and then if you get ashed here, which would be on the hers, so for example, you would just be able to add the soldier, and then now you're stuck with just 1 soldier. Now I do admit, generally opponents I don't think would ash or on this first effect, but I'm just saying if they do, then you're just completely screwed. So that's one reason why I don't do it, aside from the fact that you're kind of extending more than you have to. So for example, let's say you actually start out off with the hers first and then use the machine dude. This is sort of what I actually prefer to do, because if your opponent does not ash, for example, and they don't have hand traps, then you can kind of do your typical route and bring out the Infinity and the Anaconda and Rampage or Dragoon, and you still have the soldier in hand for a possible follow play next turn if you somehow didn't kill them. But even if you got ashed here, at least now you can go into Mirage and then use trigger hers effect to get the Cyber Dragon, and then you would pitch the Cyber Dragon, get the soldier, use soldier's effect, get another card in hand, and then you can just go into Anaconda and either bring out Dragoon or Rampage that way. So at least this way it's a bit safer. It may not be as explosive, but I find it's a bit more conservative approach. You get to save a little more on resources just in case. So that's sort of the path I take when I have those 3 cards. So now let's cover a situation where, let's say technically you're in a place where you have another free body, so that you don't necessarily have to use Nova's effect to bring another extra body to go into Anaconda. So what I mean by this is, let's say you Nibiru your opponent, so you have a Nibiru, so you have that extra body, and I'm talking about instances where you have an extra body that's not a Cyber Dragon monster. So let's say you have a baby Cyber Dragon and a target, and you use machine dupe and you get the 2 Cyber Dragons, right? So let's say you just you can go into your Nova. And at this instance, normally when you don't have that extra body, you would, link off the this into Mirage, and then use Nova's effect to bring another body. So you can have 2 bodies to go into Anaconda, right? But in this instance, you may think, oh, well, you know what? I don't have to. So you might just go straight into Infinity, and then you just link these 2 off into Anaconda. Now the problem here though is, as you can see, if you're in a situation where you're actually trying to bring out Rampage specifically, then you actually get screwed, because you actually only have 1 Cyber Dragon monster in the graveyard, and you obviously don't want to banish the Infinity to try to bring out Rampage. So that's something you have to be wary of, is in situations where you use machine dupe and you want to specifically bring out Rampage, you do still would have to use Nova's effect. So for example, let's rewind back. So even though you have the body to bring out Anaconda, you would still, if you're trying to bring out the Rampage, you would still have to link off that Naxter, use Nova's effect, and you can bring out Naxter or Cyber Dragon. If you bring out the Naxter, just don't use its effect, because otherwise you're going to get locked into machines. Now of course this play makes you vulnerable to Nibiru as well, but it's just in the instance where you're trying to go for that game and your opponent has no monsters, then you would want to bring out this way and then go into Infinity, then Anaconda, and then now at this point you can even bring out Dragoon, because you already have a 3000 beat stick. But I'm just saying, if you were to try to bring out Rampage, then you would have still had to use Nova's effect. Another situation to cover is if your baby Cyber Dragon was actually special summoned. So for example, let's say you had a hand like this, and then let's say you normal the core, but then it got gammaed, right? And it gets destroyed, and then you're like, oh well, it's fine, I have rough system, and you bring it back and you do the machine do play and you bring out the 2 Cyber Dragons. Now this time it gets a little awkward, because you can now no longer link this off into Mirage, because this was actually special summoned. So you can't do your typical Nova Infinity play and go into like Anaconda. So in this instance, if they actually have Gamma or Gammaed you, you could actually still OTK that turn, assuming you were going second. because if you use Anaconda and you brought out Dragoon by using just those two and you keep the Cyber Dragon, for example, Dragoon would pop the Gamma and Driver for 3,500. You would enter battle, attack for another 35, they're at 7,000, and then attack for game with Cyber Dragon. So just keep that in mind. All Mirage, remember, it has to be a normal summon monster, so if you ended up special summoning that baby Cyber Dragon, then you can't link off into All Mirage, which can affect your future plays. So another situation to cover is, let's say you're going first and you pretty much got what you asked for. You know, you have the sidecar that's strong and you can have your extenders, but you know, obviously the greedy play would be to search the core with the emergency, and the core can add you the overflow. But if you know your opponent plays Gamma, for example, it may be worthwhile to just play conservatively, because if you get the core and that gets Gamma, then you get heavily punished and you don't really get to set up anything, right? So sometimes I will just add the hers instead, because it does not trigger. And remember, core's effects on summon rather, is mandatory, so you can't play around with that either. So that's why, you know, for example, let's say you search the hers, you play that machine dupe, and you get the 2 Cyber Dragons. Then you go into Nova, and then here you would link off into All Mirage. I actually don't use hers effect here usually, because I like to save it until, let's say for example, I get Nibiru, like just in case I can just use it for Rampage's effect. So let's say you're using Nova's effect now to try to special out the hers, which at that point, if I do successfully special out the hers and I link it off, then I would use hers effect there. But let's say your opponent does Gamma here, right? And you could technically save it with the All Mirage, but you know, I don't think there's a point to that. You let the Gamma go, Nova will get destroyed, and then Nova will trigger, and you can either bring out the Mechaba or the Chimeric Tech Rampage. So in this instance, let's say we bring out the Rampage and use Rampage effect. Now you can send the core and the hers, and then you can trigger hers to add back the core just for the follow-up. And then now, again, you can just link these two off to go into Anaconda, and let's say you bring out Dragoon and you have the summon limit. You can pop like at least their Gamma, you could leave their Driver so that gets banished, but that's sort of a workaround to play it safe and have a good strong turn 1 board. Now another play to be wary of is, you know, if your core is in the grave and your opponent has a monster and you don't, obviously you can banish it, and you typically special out the Naxxur. Now in terms of the positioning, so if your opponent doesn't have any attack position monsters, then you should bring Naxxur into attack so that you can suck it up with that Infinity. And in terms of target, if you have Nova or Infinity and you play the second Infinity, I do generally like to go with the Nova so that I can bring into the second Infinity. Now keep in mind, if you're in a situation, let's say it wasn't through core or anything, but if you're in a situation where you already summoned Infinity that turn, remember you can only summon Infinity once per turn using Nova's material. So let's say it was something in a situation where, you know, you got Nibiru or something and you already had the Naxxur in hand, and because let's say you had already summoned Infinity that turn and your opponent Nibiru and Gamma you to negate the Infinity negate, and that's why it happened, then you can at least, you know, bring that, and then just you would have to bring the Infinity back instead of Nova, because you can't go into it again through the standard way. So you would just have to, at least this way you can like suck up your Naxxur or something, or maybe if your opponent put Nibiru in attack position, you can suck that up. So that's something to keep in mind of. Okay, so now let's just cover some more random tips. So let's say with Pot of Prosperity, if you do play it, in terms of what I banished, let's say up to 6. So the first 5 that are for sure will be these. So because I also play 2 copies of each, I can manage to get rid of 1 of each. In terms of the 6th card though, it actually kind of varies between, I would say, these 3 cards at most. And so it just depends on the matchup. So if it's a deck where you probably won't be bringing out Zeus, you know, you can banish that. If it's a deck where they don't really play anything in the extra monster zone, you can get rid of the Mega Fleet. In terms of All Mirage though, this you have to be very careful if you're going to banish this. Basically, the only time you could afford to banish this is if you hard drew the Galaxy Soldier, so you don't need the Cyber Dragon Engrave to activate Repair Plan because you already have access to the Soldier. Or let's say your opponent actually has something in the extra monster zone, so instead of going into the All Mirage, you can actually go into the Mega Fleet to get that Cyber Dragon Engrave. In that instance, you could banish the All Mirage, so that's where the kind of flex spot comes, but you have to be, again, very careful because it can really screw you if you banish the All Mirage when you actually needed it, and it will just like really mess up all of your plays. So another random tip is if your opponent has no monsters on the field, and also, even to be safe, no set cards, so you just expect they probably had a lot of hand traps. So for example, let's say you summon the core and somehow it resolves and you can get the Cyberload Fusion. So in this instance, so for example, if you were to machine dupe and get the 2 Cyber Dragons, So now of course you could do your standard Nova Infinity play, but you know, that can attract a lot of hand traps. Even though you could play through it, you never know if they have some other additional hand traps and it might not work out. So in this instance, what you could actually do is just enter battle phase straight away, and then if you play Cyber Twin, then you can actually just put these two back, for example, and then bring out the Cyber Twin, and then this would attack twice and it will be game. And actually you only need really up to these two, because this combined will be 25 and then this together would be 56, so in total it would be 81, so it would still be enough for game. And the one positive of this approach is that you know, it can play through hand traps. So for example, you're not link summoning, so they won't be able to bring down the Phantasmi and kind of get to shuffle their hand, for example, and plays around Nibiru and things like that. I would say the downside of this approach is, for example, it doesn't happen as much nowadays because, for example, something like Gizmic that they can actually special from the hand and it just kind of catches you off guard. That would be something. Another card that could ruin this sequence would be something like Ghost Murder, which again does not see too much play. Really saw it in Sky Strikers, but you don't really see that deck much anymore anyways. Also a rogue option too. So that's just something to keep in mind to kind of make things simple for that OTK. If your opponent has nothing on the field, and I only really, when I play the Pure Vision and I actually play this and the Cyber Twin, I only kind of did this if they didn't have any sets either, because otherwise it would just be too risky. But the play is there. So I think another thing that helps to know is kind of just more other awkward ways of bringing out the Nova Infinity play, because not always it's straightforward as, you know, Core Machine Dupe or Soldier Hearse. So for example, if you had some weird hand like this, like technically you could still do it, right? If your opponent controls a monster, you'd specialty Cyber Dragon, you could normal the Hearse, link that off into Almirage, Hearse triggers, you get the Cyber Dragon, and you can use the Rev system to bring it from your hand. Obviously that's kind of neg, but I'm just saying there are some other awkward ways to bring out your Nova Infinity play that, you know, you should still be aware of. Other awkward plays to OTK would be something like this. Let's say, you know, your opponent doesn't even have a monster, so you could still, you know, Hearse, link it off for Almirage, get the Cyber Dragon. You could pitch the Cyber Dragon with the Naxxter target the Cyber Dragon, and then you could just link these two off into the Seeger, and then Overload Fusion. And so again, nothing conventional, but even with some weird hands, you could still OTK, for example, especially when you hard draw Overload Fusion. That usually is something that can happen. So in terms of outs to opponent's Dragoon, of course we have some options. For example, we have a searchable Kaiju, although of course you have to if you have to actively search it through Repair Plant, then they might negate that. You also can, for example, if you were to able to bait out one negate going into Seeger, because it can pump itself to 42, it would be able to get over the 4000 Dragoon. Another unconventional option is, and shout out to Frank, one of my comments in my videos, if you were to, for example, they probably, assuming they have an Anaconda and Dragoon, in that case, you know, for example, if you special Cyber Dragon and you have something like a baby Cyber Dragon, you could link that off either onto, you know, something like Almirage or Anima, for example, doesn't matter. And then at this point, you would link off, or not link off, contact fuse the Almirage and the opponent's, if your opponent had an Anaconda, you would contact fuse that away as well. And then you would have something like a 3600 Mega Fleet and going over the 3000 Dragoon without triggering any effects for them to be able to, you know, negate and pump the Dragoon. So lastly, if your opponent has like a Zeus with multiple materials and you have a core engrave and you don't have a monster and they obviously have the Zeus, usually, you know, obviously when you banish the core from grave, you're usually summoning out the Naxxter, but against the Zeus, it's probably best to special Hearse instead, because they'll be forced to blow it up, because otherwise you can just go into Chimera Tech Fortress, and then once they do, then Hearse would trigger, and you would also get the Cyber Dragon, and then you could special that, and it forces them to use it again. So it depends on like the material that, the number of materials that Zeus have, and kind of the other plays that you would have after you clear the Zeus, at least the materials, but that's something where you can kind of force out multiple Zeus sends. Alright guys, so that was it for the Cyber Dragon tip video. Hope you found that useful. Hope you found at least one tip that you can take away. Take care guys.